probably take a break about partway through, and then after the first hour, if anybody, if you want to leave, you can. But I'll stay to answer questions for anybody that has them as we go forward. I want to start by talking about a couple of things. First of all, take a look at your review sheet. Those of you that haven't been to a review session yet, I think it would be helpful to just sort of review for everybody, just so that you're all on the same page for tomorrow, about what the test actually covers and how the test is actually structured. So remember, the test has 5 parts. Okay, the test has 5 parts. Part 1 is multiple choice. There are 20 multiple choice questions. Each one of the multiple choice questions is worth 2 points. So, I'm sorry, each one's worth 1 point. So this section is worth 20 points. Okay, this first section, each multiple choice is worth 1 point each. I've already given you 2 examples from the test in the other review sessions. I'll give you another example today, so you'll get a chance to sort of talk about one of the questions on the test. But if you know these terms, the basic idea behind these terms, then you should have no problem with the multiple choice. What I did basically for the multiple choice is I went back through old AP exams and I pulled out questions that would be relevant to things we have studied. So it's sort of giving you dual practice for those kinds of things. But most of the questions, if you look at them logically, you should have no problem answering the questions. Are there any questions about any of these terms on this list? We've gone over them in both the other review sessions. But is there anything that anybody noticed as they studied all weekend long to notice that there's something that you missed? Michael? 1968. 1968. We're going to talk about that today, actually. But if you remember in the history quest, one of the things we talked about is that 1968 and 1969 are major turning point years in American history. And partly because it's sort of the culmination of a lot of different things that happened in 1968. I would argue that 68 and 69 are both the culmination of the counterculture voices. So sort of like the Woodstock happens in 69. But in 68, you have 2 really major events occur. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. And with the assassinations of those 2, it sort of ends this period of optimism and then gives way to this period of cynicism that will sort of pervade American culture, I would say, even until to this day. So when you think about 1968, those assassinations sort of mark the end of that feeling of hope in the 1960s. That civil rights was going to move forward, that we were going to end the war in Vietnam, that these things were happening. And remember, 68 is sort of that point where the Vietnam War turned bad as well. It's when the American public really started to turn against the war. So 1968 is a major turning point here, and I think it does relate directly to some of the questions of progress that we've had. Or if you think about it in terms of the essay question for the test, how close has America come to Lincoln's vision? I think that's a year that provides some really negative evidence for that answer. Does that make sense? Any other questions on the list? Chad? Sorry? The election of 1800. Who was elected in 1800? Thomas Jefferson. So why is the election of 1800 so significant? Number one, it's the first time that we had a transfer of political parties in American history. We went from the Federalists with John Adams to the Democratic Republicans with Thomas Jefferson. But more importantly, though, it shows that, remember, what did Jefferson's political philosophy stand for? What was his argument? Claire, what was his argument?
Strict reading of the Constitution and like a small government.
That we needed to read the Constitution strictly. So the Democratic Republicans believed in a strict reading of the Constitution. That was Jefferson's view. But what happened when he became president in 1800?
He realized that in order to actually get one that accomplished or the
Okay, I wouldn't say abuse it, but he said you had to read it broadly, right? So he changed his philosophy from saying it has to be a strict reading to the recognition that when you're president, you're going to have to do some things that maybe aren't necessarily in the Constitution. For example, the Louisiana Purchase. And he knew that was unconstitutional, but also knew it was for the good of the country. So he sort of goes back on his original political philosophy. And because of that, the Democratic Republicans, that time forward, become like the Federalists. Everybody starts reading the Constitution broadly. And that's known in American political history as the era of good feelings, because there was really only one political party. Any other questions from the list? Everyone's good on the list? So, yeah, Anish.
When did they start with that? When did they start separating?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
When did the parties start separating?
They would separate again with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. So Jackson's Democratic Party then becomes the new political party, and the people who are opposed to Jackson become the Whig Party. So really 1828 is the year that the party split again. And then you have Democrats and Whigs. So if you think about American political history, right, you start with Democratic Republicans versus Federalists. Then the Federalists go away and you have just Democratic Republicans. Then when Jackson is elected president, he forms the Democratic Party, and the anti-Jacksons become the Whig Party. So then you have Democrats and Whigs. That lasts all the way up until the Civil War, and then you get Republicans added to that mix. The Whigs sort of splinter over the slavery issue, and you're left with Democrats and Republicans from that time forward in American history. The modern political parties, though, get their definition in the Cross of Gold speech in 1896, and that's when the Democratic Party becomes the party of the people, the Republican Party becomes the party of laissez-faire or business, and that stays the way it is still today. Does that make sense? Any other questions about the list before we move on? All right, let me show you a question from the test. This is a question that would be multiple choice, and see what you think. Because both social Darwinism and capitalism agree that A, humans are descended from lower animals. B, the government should ease the lot of the poor. C, free competition promotes human progress. Or D, government ownership of the majority of the means of production is desirable. Which of those, well, first of all, let's eliminate the ones we know aren't true. What can we eliminate that we know is not true? Maddie? D, for sure. Why can we eliminate D for sure? What is D describing? Socialism, right? So, government ownership of the majority of the means of production. That's actually communism. So, D is describing communism, so we know that's not true. What else can we eliminate there? Nick? A, humans are descended from lower animals. Okay, that would be evolution, right? So that's describing evolution or scientific Darwinism. So, Isham? B, because government easing the lot of the poor would be socialism, right? So the question's giving you socialism, it's giving you communism, and obviously the only one that's left is C, free competition promotes human progress. So both with capitalism and social Darwinism, they're both saying that for society to progress, you need free competition. So the correct answer is C on that.
What was the question that we went over on these Saturday?
I can't tell you. Okay. Any other questions about the multiple choice? So if you've been to the review sessions, you've now got 3 questions that you can't get wrong if you pay attention. And then there's one question I can tell you that's just sort of a fun question. The number 20 is sort of a funny question, so that one you should not get wrong either. If you're paying attention to the course of the year, you should not get that one wrong. All right, so you got 20 questions there. Each one's worth 1 point. That's 20% of the test. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to move on to part 2 of the test, which is the analysis of documents or videos. You're going to have 5 questions here. Some of them are going to be documents. Some of them are going to be pictures, and at least one is a video. Now, if you looked on Schoology over the weekend, I posted 4 videos. All 4 of them are possible for the test. One of them is the one that I put on the test. So if you watch those videos, they're all short. They're like 3 to 5 minutes. If you watch those videos, it should help you with that part of the test. So it's just a short answer question related to that video. So each one of these is really measuring your ability to analyze information. So let me show you a political cartoon that I really like a lot. See what you think of this political cartoon. So this political cartoon, let's just take a look at the cartoon first. What is it showing? What does it show, Maddie?
The Trojan horse.
Okay, it's got a Trojan horse. What's a Trojan horse? What's a Trojan horse? What's the symbolism of a Trojan horse?
It's a military tactic used by the Romans to get control. Whoa. The Greeks. Okay, so it's a Trojan.
This is actually not a Trojan horse. It's a Trojan donkey. Okay, it's a Trojan donkey. The donkey is the symbol of the Democratic Party, don't forget. So here we have this Trojan horse. Now, a couple things you should note. The wall says American citizens, and you can see people looking over the gates, and there's like a flag up at the top. And there's somebody inside the horse, and he's like shushing everybody else. He's saying shh, like to tell people to be quiet. And you can see that on the door, the sort of gateway, is the Constitution of the United States. So if you are sort of analyzing this political cartoon, what analysis, what could you lay out as fact that this political cartoon is saying? What's the commentary here?
That New Deal sounds good, but like once you let it go through the Constitution.
Okay, good. That's a really good analysis, because the idea behind a Trojan horse, the symbolism of a Trojan horse is not what it seems to be, right? So if you just look at the symbolism of a Trojan horse, you know the idea, don't look a gift horse in the mouth? That comes from the Trojan horse. The idea that it's not as good as it seems. So here's this Trojan donkey. It says New Deal tyranny, and as Justin points out, once you let it through the Constitution, then it could wreck the country, is sort of the analysis there. So if that were the cartoon that I put on the test, and I asked you to sort of assess the argument being made here, what would you need to use for facts about the New Deal that you'd be able to show that you were informed about this text?
Unconstitutional programs like NRA.
Okay, so you would use this, like the things that FDR maybe did that went beyond the Constitution. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NRA, the National Recovery Agency, or National Recovery Act. Why were those two things unconstitutional? Specifically, why were they unconstitutional? That's right. Because if a farmer grows his crops in his own state and never sells them to anybody in any other state, why should the federal government be able to regulate what that farmer does? The argument would be that they can't, that the federal government has limits. They can only regulate interstate commerce, commerce between states. So do you see how people would argue that this went beyond the idea? So is there any support that this cartoon was right? Is there any sort of anything we can see that FDR does that would support this idea? What? Court packing. Why would court packing help support that? Why would court packing help support it?
Because if he gets enough of the Supreme Court justice that he wants, they won't declare things he's done unconstitutional.
That's right. And in fact, they did declare what he had done unconstitutional, right? As Kevin points out, NRA and AAA were declared unconstitutional by the court. So what does FDR do? He threatens to pack the court with the justices he wants and sort of tries to threaten them into getting what he wants. Don't forget, in his New Deal, in his speech, in his inaugural address, what did he tell the United States? What did he tell the people of the country when he was inaugurated? That he's going to break the rules in order to save the country. That we have nothing to fear but fear itself. That he was going to have to do whatever he had to do to save the country. Okay. So obviously this cartoon is critical of FDR, but in your analysis I might want you to assess, was the cartoon right? Is the cartoon wrong? Is it a little bit too extreme? So, but you'd have to use some of those facts that I just laid out. The inaugural address, the court packing idea, the AAA, the NRA, but also the positive impact that the New Deal had. Overall, as a summary, it's important that you remember that FDR used some socialism to save capitalism from itself. Like you could argue that in the long term, the short-term violations of the Constitution led to its long-term protection. That it was able to survive in the long term because he broke it in the short term. Say that one more time. The Constitution was able to survive in the long term because he broke it in the short term. I think that might be something to keep in mind as you look at this question. Okay.
I was just wondering, when we're analyzing this, do you want to analyze it from 2013 or do you want us to analyze it from the history?
2013. But obviously you're going to take into consideration all the things that happened. Okay. So the second part of the test, which is the document video analysis, that gives you an example. So there's at least 2 documents on the test. There's a cartoon, there's a video, so that should give you an idea of what you have to do. So you've got to go and use the history to connect to sort of the before and after of the cartoon or to the document. But I'll be very specific in the question that what I want you to do. In terms of the response, I'm not looking for an essay answer. It should be a paragraph. You can use bullets, you can use a list, you can sort of like lay out facts just like in a list if you want. But for this part of the test, it's not really like a long, huge written essay. It's just the basic facts. Okay? Any questions about the second part of the test? Okay, part 3. Look at part 3 of the test. Constitutional milestones. Under the constitutional milestone, I'm going to give you 4 of these on the test. And then I'm going to ask you to rank them, the relative importance of each of them. There's no right or wrong answer. I think you can make an argument. But as I said to the kids that came on Saturday, what I would do if I were you is I would sort of categorize them into really important and lesser important so that you'll be able to sort of rank whatever I put on there. So for example, if you look at, let's say I put these 4 on the test. Tell me what the rank would be if you put these 4 on the test. If I put the cabinet, the nullification crisis, Skank v. U.S., and Marbury versus Madison. If those were the 4, what would your rank be and why? Ben?
I would put Marbury versus Madison at the top.
Okay, why?
That expanded powers of the court, which allowed them to do many things they were able to do later on in U.S. history. Okay, good. So notice that Ben's analysis takes into consideration the long-term impact. Marbury versus Madison is so important because it allows all those other cases to happen. It gives the court judicial review power. And by having judicial review power, they're able to sort of have a check on the power of the other branches. Okay, that's important. So I definitely think you could make an argument for Marbury at number 1. But what else on that list would you, what would you put next, Kevin?
I would put nullification crisis next because I think nullification crisis is like the opportunity to the Civil War. And the crisis really solved by the Civil War.
Okay, so we know that the question brought up in the nullification crisis is really the crux of the problem with the Constitution in the first place. What is the problem with the Constitution? It's vague, right? So because it's vague, over time, what happened? Power was added to the national government. The president got more powerful. The court got more powerful. The Congress got more powerful. And as that happened over time, the states and the people lost out. So by the time you get to the 1830s, 30 years before the Civil War, Hayne and Webster have their big argument. So if there's something to remember on this test, Hayne and Webster, we talked about it so many times, you definitely should know what the argument was. What was Hayne's argument? What's Hayne's argument, Claire?
That the government should be stricter because it's too big. We've already manipulated it way too many times.
That we've broken the Constitution repeatedly, and therefore the document is invalid. His argument was a legal argument, remember. He said the document, the Constitution, that all the states signed was a legally binding agreement. It was like a contract. And that the contract had been broken repeatedly. Whether it's Marbury versus Madison, or the Cabinet, or Alien and Sedition, or the Bank of the United States, all of those things invalidate the document because they've broken it repeatedly. So therefore, South Carolina should not have to abide by it anymore. And they should be able to nullify whatever laws they don't think are appropriate. On the other side, Webster says what?
That the Constitution should be viewed like it was necessary to make all those breaks in it, and therefore should be abided by more passionately.
Very good. He basically says, he gives the patriotic argument, right? The emotional argument against the legal argument. And his emotional argument is, yes, you're right, it's been broken. But every time we've broken it, it's been for the common good, for the greater good, for the good of the union, of all of us, not just one individual state. And that's the beauty of our Constitution. That previews the Civil War. So as Kevin points out, that particular item on the list is probably really important as well, if you think about it in relative terms. But you have to sort of give a reason, which I just explained to you when I just summarized that argument. Okay. So then why would we put cabinet and what was the other one? Oh yeah, and Skank versus US. Why would we put those lower on the list, Matt?
Well, for the cabinet, it didn't cause so much controversy as the others. There's less debate over whether we should have a cabinet.
Right. So it's important because it's one of the first violations, right? But it's a pretty minor one in the terms of it being controversial. What about Skank?
It was an argument up there from the danger, but there were 2 Supreme Court cases on here. It was the one with Marbury versus Madison, which obviously had a bigger impact.
Right. If I were going to rank them, I would probably rank them nullification, Marbury,
skank, and then cabinet. But you could make an argument between those. I think it would be, but you understand why it would sort of relatively rank them that way, right? Everyone sees why. Everyone knows what happened in the skank case. That's the clear and present danger case that led to the restrictions on free speech. It's another example of how the government tends to decide constitutional rights in times of crisis and sort of limit them despite what the Constitution says. Yeah.
If you could compare the Trail of Tears versus what's found for education, what would you rank?
That's a good question. Trail of Tears versus Brown v. Board of Education. I would definitely rank Brown v. Board above Trail of Tears. And the reason would be that without Brown v. Board, you don't have the subsequent civil rights movement in the 1960s. So Brown v. Board in 1954 sets the standard for the Little Rock Nine, the Freedom Riders, the lunch sit-ins, Martin Luther King's passive resistance, and ultimately Malcolm X's more violent sort of approach. But ultimately, I think that Brown v. Board is more important. I think Worcester v. Georgia is important because it shows the power of the presidency and sort of ignoring the court. But if I had to rank them, I would put Brown v. Board ahead because of the subsequent impact that it had, more so than the Trail of Tears. Becky? Sure. The election of 1824, why is that on the list? Why is that a constitutional milestone? What happened in 1824 in that election? Nick?
Of the four presidents who ran, no one had the majority vote.
Okay, so there were 4 candidates in that election, remember? That's the election where the guy that had a stroke and was like a vegetable came in 3rd, and Henry Clay came in 4th, remember? Like he lost to the guy in a coma. So basically you had 4 candidates in 1824. You had the Secretary of State, right? You had the Secretary of State, who was the Secretary of State in 1824?
Quincy Adams.
John Quincy Adams, that's right. So John Quincy Adams is running. He's from Massachusetts. He's the son of a former president, John Adams. You have Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives from Kentucky. You have William Crawford from Georgia, a Southerner. And you have Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, a Westerner. So this election is important because a couple of things occur here. It's the first election where sectionalism really takes a toll. We've got New Englander, Southerner, 2 Westerners. So we've got people from different parts of the country sort of really clearly dividing the country based on where they're from. We know that Jackson was a war hero from the War of 1812. We know that he never went to high school. So he's running for president as the common man, right? And then at the same time, we have Henry Clay, who's very elitist from Kentucky. He's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. There's a lot of political power. We have John Quincy Adams, who's very well educated, Secretary of State, son of a president, and William Crawford, Georgia's favorite son. They all run against each other. And in this election, no one gets a majority. Okay, so under the Constitution, if no one gets a majority, who decides? The House of Representatives. Well, that gives Henry Clay a great opportunity. Even though the Constitution says the House will decide between the top 2, and Henry Clay came in 4th, he now gets to be the kingmaker. He gets to be the one that sways the vote in the House of Representatives because he's the Speaker of the House. Who does he sway the vote to? He sways the vote to John Quincy Adams. And even though Jackson had the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, he didn't have a majority. So Jackson sort of looks at that and says, we don't really live in a democracy. I won. I got the most votes, but I'm not becoming president. Our system is corrupt. And that's why he declares there's a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, which he can back up when conveniently John Quincy Adams names Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. So it was almost as if you're handing the presidency in the future to Henry Clay in exchange for his support now, and that's sort of this idea of the corrupt bargain. Really, one of the things that it does is it spurs the creation of the Democratic Party. It spurs the creation of Jackson's circling the country for 4 years, criticizing the system and saying we have to trust the common man to actually elect the right person. So that's sort of why it's significant. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How is the creation of the Democratic Party significant in terms of constitution?
I think I would argue that it showed that the Constitution's electoral process was somewhat flawed. And it allowed for people to point out that it isn't really democratic. Remember, one of the things we talked about with the Constitution was, in a way, it's a great piece of propaganda, right? It makes everyone think, oh, we live in a democracy, but we really don't. I mean, only 1/4 of the powers in the U.S. government are directly elected by the people, and that's the House of Representatives. The Senate was appointed, the president was appointed essentially by the Electoral College, and the court is appointed by the president. So if you're looking at the 4 parts of our government, 3 of the 4 are elite. Only the 1 is the common people. And so I think this election really brought that to the front. It really pointed it out to people, made them realize that the system didn't really lead to a democratic outcome. It would be in the early 1900s, in that period of progress. Remember, we talked about the question of progress. That's when we got the direct election of senators, the constitutional amendment to directly elect senators. I would say I'm not sure we have ever actually remedied that situation, but it's gotten better over time.
For the part of the constitutional when the ranking is doing, the ranking is constitutional influence or like general historical?
I would say constitutional influence would be your best argument to me. So, but obviously, if there's something on there that's significant historically, that's going to make a difference too, right? I mean, I think, look at Brown v. Board as an example. Brown v. Board doesn't have so much constitutional historical significance, other than the fact that it actually made the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do what they were intended to do, almost 100 years after they've been passed. So you could argue that part of it constitutionally, but I think you also have to play into that. It then led to the subsequent, these other events. So, I mean, I think you have to intertwine them, but it should be primarily the constitutional significance that you consider. Okay. Any other questions on the list? There will be 4. All you have to do is rank them and explain why you gave each one their rank. Okay? Don't fail to sort of leave off your reason for the person that's at the bottom or the thing that's at the bottom. You might be able to argue your top choice. Make sure for each of your choices, you give a little description of why you put it where you put it. Okay? Everyone's good on the rest of the things on that list? All right. So the next part, the last part of the test, is actually the essay and the Harkness discussion, parts 4 and parts 5. The essay part of the test, you have to decide how close you think America has come to Lincoln's vision. And I'm going to allow us to have a Harkness discussion, 25 to 30 minutes, that will allow you to share ideas with your classmates so you can hear sort of their thinking about sort of what things were really milestones in the story. So as you go back through, one of the things I would encourage you to do is use the list that I've given you for the multiple choice as some of the key facts that you want to think about, like where they play in, like pro or con. So as I did on Saturday, let me sort of give you some examples. As you go back through the story of American history, you can pick different moments that we've really spent a lot of time sort of discussing. And if you think about the titles of the units that we discussed, that should help you. So when you think about the earliest stuff we talked about, the colonization of America, that unit was called City Upon a Hill, right? So why did I call it that? Because the question is, how much are we going to be this bright, shining example to the world? And when you think about that idea, the whole idea there was, John Winthrop's speech that we are this bright beacon, but there were lots of things that contradicted that. So I think you could look at that early period and you could say, here are some reasons why we are a beacon. Like the adaptations, right? That would be a good example. The adaptations that the early colonies made in sort of developing and becoming more successful. But at the same time, you could look at that and say there's also some negative there. Like the fact that one of those adaptations was slavery is a pretty negative piece of evidence. So if you look at the major themes of what we've talked about, it should help you to sort of figure out sort of where do these things all fit together. So what I thought we could do is sort of let's go through and look at the major themes and sort of try to categorize them and look deeper at each one of them to sort of see what things you could use as evidence. So if we go back to this early period, we talked about City Upon a Hill. What were some of the things that we discussed in terms of the City Upon a Hill? Nick.
Adaptation.
Okay, so adaptation. What were some of the adaptations you could use as evidence?
Forgetting the headright system.
Okay, the headright system. Indentured servants. What else?
Mayflower Compact.
Yeah, that's a great one. Local government, Mayflower Compact. House of Burgesses.
The growing of tobacco.
Cash crops. Courrier de Bois, the Frenchmen, the runners of the woods. What else? Sure, because that showed adaptation, and eventually the Americans caught on to that, right, by doing some of these things. So you also then we have negative examples like slavery. You have the failure of those early colonies because they tried to be too European, right?
Why is it so?
Well, I think it shows an adaptation because they were able to sort of figure out a way to get the right kind of people to work there. But I think you're right to point out that it could be a positive and a negative, right? Because this leads to this whole idea of the haves versus the have-nots, which is going to be pervasive in American history. If someplace in your test you don't refer to haves versus have-nots, there's something missing. Okay? So you should be thinking about how much we've talked about that, because it pervasively affects American history all the way through to the current day, but especially in that time of progress, the bottom-up change time period, which we'll get to in a second. So when you think about the city upon a hill period, you can see just with this example, we've got pros and cons here that we can look at. But yeah, there are some pieces of evidence that America was exceptional, that we were finding ways to be successful. But even within that, there are some negatives. Let's not forget basically the extermination of the Native Americans, right? King Philip's War that happens during this time. So that's clearly a negative thing. Think about the Salem witch trials we spent so much time talking about. That's clearly a negative. So when you think about this period of time, you've got a bunch of things you can consider in both ways. Okay. So from city upon a hill, what did we move on to next? What did we move on to after city upon a hill? Right, so we moved on to the period. So we know that because of city upon a hill, we had these adaptations. And then that next unit was Join or Die, which is this idea of the American Revolution. The Americans weren't European anymore. So this have versus have not conflict, how are you going to sort of argue this period of time? What evidence do we have in this period of time to use? Okay, so this manipulation for power, right? That they basically turned the have-not anger against the British, and that led to this uprising. That would be a negative, probably, right? But what positive can we say comes from this? I think the Declaration has to be key here, because even though when Jefferson writes it, he knows it's not true. The bottom line is that eventually the Declaration is going to provide the sort of foundation for what we want to be as a country. It's a mission statement. And even though at the time he knew it wasn't true, I think you'd have to argue that without that, we don't have something to aspire to. Even today, that aspiration that comes from the Declaration, I think, is really important. Now, we know that after the war was won, you can also talk about the American ingenuity, right? You could use Battle of Princeton as a good example of that, with George Washington sort of using his Native American battle tactics to sort of win the war, even sort of accidentally, that America ends up winning. But then they have to do something about it, which is the Articles of Confederation, which fail and lead to the development of one of the most important things in American history, the Constitution. So when you think about the Constitution is supposed to be the blueprint that gets us to the Declaration. But what's the problem with it? We mentioned it repeatedly. It's too vague, right? So over time, its implementation will be very important. Okay. And that led us to the next period, which was what? What? Manifest Destiny, which is this idea, this period of time would be the sort of growth of the country, right? So Manifest Destiny would be the implementation of the Constitution. We have all these constitutional milestones to think about, and you have a list of them right on the review sheet. So you got the Cabinet, you got the Bank of the United States, you got the Alien and Sedition Acts, You've got all the way up to Worcester v. Georgia and the nullification crisis. All of those things are relevant to this period of the Constitution, especially at the beginning. As it's implemented, the power of the federal government will grow. Now, let's use an example here. Let's talk about the Bank of the United States, because I think it's a great example. Why is the Bank of the United States an example of both the good and the bad here? Why is it an example of both the good and the bad? And this getting us close to Lincoln's vision of the last best hope of humanity. Why does it provide us evidence both ways?
It's necessary, but it's also unconstitutional.
Okay, that's exactly right. The bank was necessary, but it was also unconstitutional. Does everyone see that? The bank helped get the country on its feet. Without the bank, without Hamilton's financial plan, there would have probably been no United States long term. But unfortunately, it also wasn't allowed under the Constitution. So it's a perfect example of the fact that you sometimes have to go beyond the Constitution in order to keep it successful, something that FDR does again 100 years later with the New Deal. So when you think about the idea of the Constitution, I think both its beauty and its greatest weakness are the same thing. That it can't do everything. And therefore, there are times that it has to be sort of ignored. But then therein lies the problem. How do you know when you're ignoring it if it's too broken, if you've broken it too much? Like I would argue, clear and present danger is an example of going too far, of restricting too much. You might disagree with that, but you can see how that argument can be made. Okay? So when you think about the constitutional period, that early time period, what's some evidence of that? Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase. Right? You can think about these early presidents that sort of made these really important decisions. Yeah, sure, because you could talk about what we do to sort of expand outward, right? So when you think about that expansion, it includes lots of things that occur during that time. And eventually, the growth of the country plus the new moral change plus what? What's that? The vagueness. So this, the Constitution, the growth of the country, the moral change, and the institution of slavery, those things added up are going to lead to the breakdown of the system. Okay? As part of this period of time, don't forget, this is when we have the Hews-Webster debate. So after Manifest Destiny, we talked about what?
Better angels.
Yep. The better angels of our nature. What's that term referred to? The better angels of our nature. It was Lincoln's second inaugural. And what's he talking about in his inaugural address? What's he saying? Why is he saying the better angels? Yeah, he basically says, we'll do what we need to do, what we've always done as Americans, if we just look back at the better angels of our nature. We don't have to have this conflict. And so we know that the Civil War happens here. And what's Lincoln's philosophy about the Civil War? Why is the war happening? Yeah. And they do attack first, right, at Fort Sumter. So remember, what Lincoln is fighting against first is he's fighting the idea of secession. Lincoln's argument is that the Union is perpetual, meaning that the Union is forever. You can't decide to leave it. Because once one state decides, I don't like it, I'm going to leave, the whole thing falls apart. So for Lincoln, secession was what he was fighting at the beginning. He wasn't fighting for or against slavery. He was fighting against the idea that a state can just decide to do whatever it wants. But from the Southern perspective, there definitely was the idea that we should be able to do what we want. The Hayne argument, that the document's been violated, therefore it's no longer valid. So for the South, it was about freedom. It was about the issue of whether they were going to lose their slaves or not, or whether Lincoln was going to take them away. Because clearly, over time, slavery was going to go extinct. The Western states were going to outnumber the Southern slave states, and it was just a matter of time. So the South wanted to break away from that before it was too late. Lincoln says, you can't. And the Civil War ultimately shifts as Lincoln realizes he can't win the war about this. He changes the meaning of the war to be about freedom. And I think one of the most important documents we talked about this year is the Gettysburg Address. Why is the Gettysburg Address so significant? Why is the Gettysburg Address so significant?
Changes the sort of American nation statement.
It redefines America. It's the second Declaration of Independence. It basically says we have to be a country that really does stand for equality. And this war will prove it, one way or the other. It's the last hope. We have to show that we really are the country we told the world that we are. We have to show everyone we are this bright, shining example. That we have to meet the promises of the Declaration. That's why the Gettysburg Address is so important. It redefines the country. One of the most important documents in American history. So, unfortunately, Lincoln doesn't get to see that through. He's assassinated, and that brought us to this period of Reconstruction, which we've talked about before as being part of this next unit, which is called what?
Progress.
Progress.
Good question.
So when you think about progress, there's a whole bunch of things to consider there. This is the time period after the Civil War where, first of all, we have Reconstruction. And what happens in Reconstruction? How can you argue pro and con for Reconstruction? 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. The radical Republicans really legitimately tried to change America for the better. They tried to force the South to change and become really meaningfully what Lincoln had hoped it would be, is a country where equality is true. But why can you argue on the negative side?
Generally, you say like all the ideas are great, but it failed.
And it failed because the Southerners refused to change, right? They found other ways to maintain the status quo. Sharecropping, the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, the KKK, all those things sort of maintain that discrimination in the South, and that's going to perpetuate. And I think most importantly, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court even says, well, we'll just forget about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and not worry about it. Okay? So when you think about Reconstruction, I think you could say the goal was good, the implementation not so. And at the same time, we have westward expansion. We have the Transcontinental Railroad. We have the robber barons, the industrialists. Great evidence there with these people. People like J.P. Morgan. So think about what J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Think about what those guys did. Because you got another great example of the pro and the con. Great capitalists. Incredible new inventions. Great technological progress for the country. The railroad is a great example of it. The country grows. The country gets new technology, oil, steel, the combustion engine, eventually automobiles, airplanes, powerboats. All those kinds of things come out of this industrial revolution, this period of industrial growth. But at the same time, who's paying the price? Social Darwinism. If social Darwinism doesn't find its way into your test somehow, probably another thing that's missing. We spent a lot of time talking about it. It's the excuse that the robber barons use for winning, right? They're supposed to win. The survival of the fittest. It makes the country better because of that. So there's another example of this progress period.
You want to talk about like this unit as a whole on justice, say like the things you say, but you use those terms on the board to say like this is good because this is going to see like capitalism actually working.
Sure, but I think then you're going to have to take into consideration what comes from this is the period of bottom-up change, right? So the next, I would argue that, yes, all this progress shows good things. So you might answer yes to this question of progress, right? But where does that progress come from? Does it come from these people who are making these things happen at the top? Or does it come from the fact that they're using and abusing so many people at the bottom that eventually those people fight back and rise up? Because remember, this is when we start to see the strikes and the unions. So what were some of the early unions that were formed? The AFL, right? The American Federation of Labor. We have the Knights of Labor with Terence Powderly. These unions that at first aren't very influential, but over time they're going to start to have more of an impact on policy, and that's bottom-up change. We have the Triangle Fire here that happens. Okay, so when you think about some of the stuff that occurs during this time period, I think it's an important piece. This is the time period of Devil in the White City. This is the time period that book, the reason I chose that book is because it's a perfect sort of fit for this. It's this idea that all this great stuff is happening. But at the same time, there's a dark side to it. Devil in the White City, we get it very specifically with the fair and the serial killer. But symbolically, that's the American story. The American story is this idea of progress with the dark side. And the question that you have to sort of decide is, does the dark side outweigh the white side? And I think that's the thing you have to think about.
It's another failure of Reconstruction. Could you say the continued divide between North and South? Because while the industry is doing well in the North, the South is still kind of in economic collapse.
Yeah, except that I would say that the new South, like that comes out of this time period, it actually does develop. Like the people from the North that go down and sort of the carpetbaggers that go down and actually help rebuild the South does make a more modern Southern economy eventually. It takes time, but it will eventually. Yeah, but you could talk about that, sure. Okay. So when you think about this time period, remember you're giving specifics, like talk about a particular robber baron or talk about some of the impact of the bottom-up change. And then that led to this next unit, which is what? It led to this period of rags to riches, this idea of bottom-up change. So when you think about the bottom-up change, let's give some examples of bottom-up change. You had to do that on your last test. What are some examples of bottom-up change? Specific, Nick.
Upton Sinclair.
Upton Sinclair's a great one. Why?
Because she was one of the muckrakers,
He
was
was
one
one of the
of
muckrakers.
he was one of the muckrakers who investigated the meat.
He writes The Jungle, right? The meatpacking industry shows the abuses there. Jacob Riis takes photographs of how the other half lives. Jacob Riis published a book of photographs called How the Other Half Lives that showed tenement buildings and the squalor of those people. The Hull House with Jane Addams, right? Rights for women and medical care for women and the poor. So you got these people that push change. What about the Grangers, which hardly anybody mentioned on their test when I showed the picture of the sod house? The Grangers, the farmers' unions of the West that organized resistance to the railroad abuses, the prices of the railroads, led to a Supreme Court case, Wabash v. Illinois, that led to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. So we start to see real change happen because of these people. So I think that's good. That's progress. I think this right here is a series of evidence that shows America moving in the right direction. Because even though these people are badly abused, people sort of rise up and fight back. And I think ultimately we see Teddy Roosevelt as president sort of begin to embody some of that bottom-up change. He starts to do things like fight against some of the monopolies, for example. We see right in the same time period the Cross of Gold speech, where the Democratic Party begins to speak for the poor. And William Jennings Bryan becomes such an important figure, even though he's largely forgotten. Well, I don't think they were motivations as much as they were an example of people fighting back against the power of social Darwinism, right? It's like people that are sort of saying, no, we're not going to be like squashed by this system. And I think that the thing that's interesting about it is you can go all the way back, and I erased it already, you can go all the way back to the Declaration, or the idea of a city upon a hill. Because why are these people so desperately fighting for these things? Because they were promised them. The idea of America has been this ideal, this promise. And so these people are willing to fight and die for it because they believe it's true. So I think one of the things about America that's really important to consider is that even if the Declaration isn't true, even if the Constitution doesn't do all the things it was promised, the fact that it's there as a goal and people continue to strive toward it, I think is a really remarkable thing. I think if you look at like the civil rights movement and all those things that happen, it's all really connected to that original promise that America stands for. And you see that happening here.
The Cross of Gold speech is primarily like opposing the gold standard, right?
The whole point of the Cross of Gold speech was like directly related. The reason it's called the Cross of Gold speech was because at the time, U.S. currency was based on gold. Like the dollar bills we printed were based on gold. The problem with that was that from 1865 to 1920, the population of the United States more than tripled. The amount of gold the United States had did not. So the number of dollars printed, there weren't enough dollars, essentially. That's the bottom line. So rather than just print more dollars, which would cause inflation, what Brian was saying is, no, we should base our money not just on gold, but on all the U.S. resources like silver and oil and everything else we have, so that we can print more dollars and not cause inflation. So basically what he was arguing was money shouldn't be just for the wealthy, that it should be available. But the impact of the speech is much more significant. There's a section of the speech which I showed to the class on Saturday when they came to the review session. There's a section of the speech, if you look at the speech, where he talks about what the Democratic Party stands for. And he says that the Democratic Party has to be the party of the struggling masses, he says. It has to be the party of the people and not the party of laissez-faire like the other side. So that sort of creates the definition of the Democratic Party.
People need to cross symbolically.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And even though the Cross of Gold part of it, it's remembered as the Cross of Gold speech, I think it's much more significant than that long term. So when you think about the rags to riches, this is that period of time where there's great technological change in the country. We have all kinds of new inventions, but we also have all these people sort of fighting back at the same time. Okay? So when you think about this and this idea, it leads to then this question of at the same time, and TR is a good example of it. Think about what TR does with the Panama Canal. Why is there a contradiction between TR being the progressive and him building the Panama Canal? Yeah, it's imperialism. TR steals the Panama Canal away from Colombia. He steals the land and says, we need it, America needs it, I'm going to take it. And he was following a pattern of other presidents like McKinley, who had taken the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, islands that America wanted. So you definitely have that contradiction of progress at home, but imperialism abroad. That led to the period of World War I, where we also had the question of the Skank versus United States case. Well, I don't see how. How does imperialism abroad cause progress at home? Yeah, but if you're doing it, the idea of the progressive movement is not necessarily that the country is moving forward. The idea of the progressive movement is that you're becoming a better country, that you're becoming more moralistic, and you're becoming more democratic. So that's why I think it's hard to sort of say, I mean, yes, the Panama Canal represents industrial or military power increase, but I'm not sure that that could be considered progressive. You see what I mean? Progressive more means like liberal. It means more like for the people. All right, everyone clear up to this point? So from that point, we then moved into this period of uncertainty, right? World War I, World War II, and the Depression. So the rags to riches, what was after rags to riches? The New Deal, right? So we got the New Deal. What's the question about the New Deal? We just talked about it a few minutes ago.
Constitutional.
Whether it's constitutional or not. So it's using socialism to save capitalism. There's lots of things we talked about with this. The FDR inaugural, where he basically says, I'm going to violate the Constitution. We know the different programs like the CWRA, the AAA, the NRA, what else? The TVA, so the CCC. So we've got the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a jobs program. We know that he rebuilt faith in the banks again because the banks had stopped lending money to people. So we know that FDR's New Deal, the question is, does it go too far? Okay, and that was really the big question mark. And then when World War II breaks out and the U.S. decides to become the arsenal of democracy, fighting for the 4 freedoms. What are the 4 freedoms? What are the 4 freedoms?
Freedom of speech, freedom from war, freedom from fear, and freedom
of religion. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. FDR says that's what the U.S. stands for. So again, it's sort of a redefinition of some of those things. We're going to go and fight in the world for these things, not just in America, but in the world. And America becomes the world superpower at the end of World War II. Nothing represents that more than the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, the technology of the United States, the development of American technology. Remember the video that I showed you about World War II? the key focus of that video was America's reason for winning World War II was its industrial capacity. The fact that we could build more tanks and more planes, and we had the technology. They used the Jeep as an example, remember in the video? So when you think about what happened over that course of time, America's industrial power that came out of this period now saves it in World War II. Okay? And America becomes the world superpower, and really the world superhero in a sense, after World War II. That we're going to be seen as the country that protects freedom and democracy in the world, which is why when we get to the 1960s, and the contradictions of Vietnam and the bad things we were doing really made everybody question that. So that gives you an overview up to 1941 and really the end of World War II. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'll go over 1945 to 2000 and just give you the final sort of assessment of what you need to know for the test. Okay? Any other questions? Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10 after 9.